Last section, 6.4, provocatively titled, The Other Humans and Us. Who are these other humans? So, there were other species of the genus Homo who coexisted with modern Homo sapiens. That is to say, as Homo sapiens were arriving and interacting with other groups in Africa and then outside of Africa, they were interacting with groups that might be considered their own species or subspecies. They are different. Now, I do want to be careful here about the us part, because sometimes what we have to be careful about is if you went back 40,000 years ago to when Homo sapiens and Neanderthals were interacting, they were both genetically and probably socially more like each other than either one would be to us today. So we do to say that we are the descendants of the Homo sapiens, not the Neanderthals. That is true, and we know that. But we should not project back in time and think that we were interbreeding with Neanderthals, because we are very different from those ancestors of 40,000 years ago. They did some interbreeding with Neanderthals. So it's just important to understand. Sometimes we like to project ourselves back into prehistory, and I might have made that mistake when I talked about some of the bipedal primates, and I said that we became bipedal. No, some other creatures in a long time ago that didn't look anything like you or me started being bipedal. We are the descendants of some of those creatures, but let's not get confused about the past. So, everybody loves the Neanderthals. Neanderthals were one of the first other species to be discovered, and they are named because they were discovered in the Neander Valley in Germany. And when they were first discovered, people were like, "Oh, we found something that is like our ancestors." They are not the direct ancestors of human beings, but they are weirdly close to us, I would say. We have since discovered that they inhabited in various forms a pretty immense geographical range. They lived from about 400,000 years ago up into 35,000 years ago, mostly in a cold climate range, but probably some of the interbreeding that we were talking about that happened was probably here in the Middle East. And the reason we know that is because when we look at later examples of Neanderthal DNA showing up, they show up both in Europe and in Asia. So it seems to be maybe this was the interbreeding part, and less so perhaps at the extremes of the range. The Neanderthals were pretty well adapted to these cold climate areas, and they went on for a decent long amount of time. What did they look like? Genetically, they were pretty close to us. They were, in general, stockier with bigger faces, bigger noses. That was probably closer than you ever wanted to see in a Neanderthal. But yeah, this is what they would think of as the difference between some of the differences between a Neanderthal and an anatomically modern human. There's an interesting thing about the Neanderthals is that in terms of the raw measurements, they had larger brains than Homo sapiens. Now, this is likely simply an effect of them having a larger body mass. Their brains were larger, but I want to pause here for a second. Having a large brain is not always an advantage. It isn't that that just gave them an advantage. It also has to do with brain organization and brain complexity. Simply having a big brain is not necessarily going to do anything for you because Homo sapiens make it and the Neanderthals didn't, for perhaps other reasons. So we have to watch out for those kinds of things. There is evidence that the Neanderthals, like the Homo groups that were emerging earlier, were able to control fire, get some warmth and cooking out of that. So evidence for controlling fire. They also developed their own style of tools, what are known as Mousterian tools. So you might wonder, well, if they were so adapted to this cold climate area and had so much cool stuff, what happened? What we don't see is we don't have evidence of that they had the same fitted clothing that the Homo sapiens were developing. They seem to have lived in smaller groups than Homo sapiens. Neanderthals seem to be more spread out, and they also don't seem to have interacted with other groups as much. So the Homo sapiens would not only clump up and develop, they would trade with each other and they would trade over long distances, whereas the Neanderthals seem to be very well adapted to certain local areas, but they don't have as much interaction across their range. And so one never knows exactly why some creatures persist and some don't. It might just be luck of the draw, but this seems to be a factor in why we have Homo sapiens around today and not Neanderthals. Neanderthal societies seem to have a lot of interesting, cool stuff. Like humans, they use different body paint and body decorations, discovered seashell pendants or jewelry, stuff they did with beads, necklaces made from bones. There's been some debate over whether there was intentional burials of the dead. Some people say yes, some people say no, that was an accident. There seems to be some indications that the Neanderthals cared for people who were not able to contribute to the group, even if they couldn't do much, that they would keep them alive longer than they would have been able to be alive. And this is true of Homo sapiens as well during this period. We see evidence that people were not simply interested in what you could contribute to survival. They would help other people out, even if they weren't necessarily contributing. You see some of the first burials that you see among Homo sapiens are of people who would have been considered disabled or physically deformed today. And so it's and they lived longer than they would have if they hadn't been cared for. Again, we don't know this, but some people believe that they must have been able to communicate. They don't seem to have exactly the same anatomical structure for communication, but they seem to have had some sense of self and being able to move in the world. So Neanderthals is the other Homo group that we know the most about, in part because they had been discovered earliest, in part because they lived in Europe and there's a lot more archaeology than digging up of the European terrain because they have the money for it than other parts of the world. More recently, we found a group that is called, they're called the Denisovans because of some bones that were found in Denisova cave in Siberia. And probably those bones in the old days would have been grouped together with something like the Neanderthals, but when they analyzed the DNA, they believe that it is part of a distinct sequence, but is not exactly like the Neanderthals and it is not exactly like Homo sapiens. The research on this is still emerging, and we don't have a lot of bone stuff and archaeology stuff, so probably if you pay attention to the news, you will see more material on this, or these ideas might be revised. But it looks like the Denisovans and the Neanderthals shared a common ancestor in this area of Eurasia from around 450,000 years ago. And then they branched off into separate species or subspecies. They're cousins, you might say. So, what happened to the Neanderthals and Denisovans? There is now evidence that Homo sapiens did do some interbreeding, these early Homo sapiens, with both Neanderthals and Denisovans. As of 15, from this evidence came out about 15 years ago. Before that, people thought they were so distinct that the Homo sapiens had replaced all other groups and that there was no interbreeding. But some pretty sophisticated genetic analysis results in the discovery that a lot of modern humans have from 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. And some groups also have some percentage of Denisovan DNA. And there is other DNA that we might have that we don't even know. There might be other Homo groups that also Homo sapiens interbred with. We just don't know about them as much. Most of these genes are not in the coding regions. That is to say that they are not hugely important for our makeup. For things like how we think or language, they don't seem to have had a huge impact. And whether or not you have Neanderthal DNA doesn't seem to influence your ability to be human or not. But there could be some influence on other traits. We just don't know. But the point of the matter is that those early groups are also a part of us. When we see Homo sapiens today, we come from a mosaic process of evolution, and we ourselves in our DNA are evidence that we've put little hominin groups together. The technical term for this that they use is called introgression. So it's a way in which a species interbreeds with a closely related either species or subspecies, and some of those genes get onboarded, but it's not a complete hybridization or overlap in which it all flows together. Now, that said, I do want to emphasize that what we see is that as of 35,000 years ago, you get one interbreeding species of Homo sapiens all across the globe. And as far away as humans go from each other, and as different as they start to look from each other, as the people that went to Australia went on and became Australian, Aboriginal to Australia, they didn't reunite with others until not too long ago. But when they got back together, they then successfully interbred and had interbreeding offspring. So as much as we have been, in some ways, we have grown isolated from each other, which is not very often because we did have all this long distance trade. But as soon as we come back together again, we all can interbreed with each other. What this means is that there is less variation now than there was back 50, 60, 100,000 years ago. That's to say, the things that we get excited about and we start calling people other races, or we start thinking that people are too short or too tall to mate together, that's minor variation compared to the kinds of interactions when you have Homo sapiens and Neanderthals trying to talk to each other. We're unique in that we're a subset of this larger range of variation. And as we've heard, we're 99.6789% identical among ourselves because we come from a very small set of this once larger variation. Today's human differences, the things that we use to classify people into races and tall, short, and lactose tolerant groups, are pretty recent emergences, and they're not a big deal in comparison to what Homo sapiens would have been interacting with a long time ago. There's a couple other cool groups that they talk about in this chapter who also fall into the Homo category, other hominins. One of the more exciting finds that was on National Geographic and television a few years ago is Homo naledi, a small-bodied and small-brained but sophisticated Homo type that lived in South Africa around 230 to 340,000 years ago. Been a lot of debate. Some people argue that Homo naledi buried their dead, which would be an incredible thing to be doing, and could do other things even though their brains were pretty small. Again, no evidence that they were interbreeding, but they might have been interacting with some of the emergent other Homo types at the time. Then, probably one of the funniest finds that we have is what were called the Hobbit people, Homo floresiensis, on Flores Island, out near in the Indonesian range. Creatures that were about 3 feet tall with pretty small brain size, but seemed to be able to do funny things like hunt little other creatures and maybe even use fire. Again, a lot of debate about that, a lot of questions about whether this should be considered a separate species. The consensus right now is that they were a result of what they call insular dwarfism. So on some islands, you can start out with big elephants, for example, and the evolutionary conditions of the island make it such that it's better to be small. So you have these small elephants. And that what might have happened is that somehow a Homo erectus population made it over to Flores Island and then started shrinking down into the Hobbit people. Again, fun. No evidence that there was any interbreeding or with the Homo species of today. I want to go back a little bit here and think about rewinding the evolutionary clock. That is to say, if we went back in time and looked at who was out there, what creatures are populating this environment, who would we bet on as those creatures are going to make it? So, for example, we rewind to the dinosaurs, which some of you have wanted to do, the dinosaurs and the mammals, you would probably bet on the dinosaurs. Be like, those are the ones that are going to make it. And they did in some ways. They became various birds. But you wouldn't bet on the mammals. Now, it happened that an asteroid hit, or whatever that thing was, a meteor, and the conditions change, the dinosaurs die. So a lot of change, funny chance stuff happens in evolution. This is a reconstruction of a huge ape that we know of as Gigantopithecus that roamed around China at about 300,000 years ago. It was big, strong, very well adapted to its environment. And if you were to go back in time and about 300,000 years ago, you'd be like, that's the ape for me. That big, giant ape is well adapted to its environment. It is strong. It's going to beat up all the other creatures around it. It's going to evolve. And sadly, no, we don't get Gigantopithecus. They all die out. They go extinct. Most of their bones get eaten by porcupines. So we only have their teeth left to reconstruct this. Done a pretty good job reconstructing from teeth. Or if we rewound to the Paranthropus, I don't know if you remember those robust Australopithecines who were super well adapted to their environment. Again, bipedal, could do other kind of cool things, powerful jaws. But as the environment changed, then eventually they went away. Or if you rewound to when the Homo sapiens were encountering Neanderthals for the first time, you might think, these puny Homo sapiens aren't going to make it. They don't have enough body hair. They're not big enough. They can't adapt to these cold climates. Look at the Neanderthals. They're already there. They're adapted. They have their own tools. They have bigger brains. They're stockier. They're ready to encounter this cold environment. You might have bet on the Neanderthals. The lesson here, though, is that in some ways, being flexible, being able to trade and interact with each other, being able to adapt to different conditions, that's what gave Homo sapiens, I want to say it's an advantage, it's the flexibility. When we think about ideas like survival of the fittest, it's not necessarily what you would have expected. So what do we know? We know that the environment is always changing and it will be changing. You may have heard about climate change. It's going to be changing. And that makes us, we should be worried about that. There's nothing, but we should also take some comfort or be optimistic because Homo sapiens have adapted to lots of different climate changes. If we think about what enables us to succeed and to change, it's not necessarily what we might consider survival of the fittest, but some people have said that what human beings or Homo sapiens excel at is survival of the generalist. People who are able to learn different things, adapt, take different courses, don't be so specialized. What we call the liberal arts, getting a general education. What are our lessons from evolution? What seems to be important? Creatures that are flexible and can change. Because the environment is always changing, it helps to be flexible and change with it. The diversity and being varied is important to evolution. It's a strength. Being able to look at things differently, different perspectives, different types of people. The being able to move around, being mobile, migrating, is hugely important to us being human. People were moving in Africa at 200,000 years ago, being bipedal and moving all around and trading and interacting with each other, and then move out and back and into other parts of the world, continuing to be interconnected and trade. And again, we think this is why Homo sapiens make it and perhaps some of the Neanderthal groups don't, is because of this constant trade and interconnection. The truth of the matter is, when human beings get isolated, they tend to get in trouble. You get isolated from another group, next thing you know, your resources have failed. So being interconnected, being able to trade with each other when things get bad in one area, or just being able to communicate with each other, has been hugely important to human history. Now, if you look at our world today, and we are facing some huge challenges. The challenge of having a lot of people in the world, the challenge of climate change, the challenge of having invented things like nuclear bombs that can destroy many people. So we might ask ourselves, what are the lessons? What societies and what people are following these evolutionary lessons? Are we being open to change and being flexible? Are we drawing upon our variation and diversity? Are we emphasizing how we are interconnected to others through trade and ways in which we move things and stuff around? What are we recognizing about how people need to move and migrate and go into different areas? And that's always been a part of our how we survive. It's a central adaptive quality. And it seems like those people groups who are embracing these things are ready to move forward. Some people don't want to do these things. But we might think about what that sets us up for, evolutionarily speaking.